Imagine standing on a continent where the fate of the world has not yet been decided. Imagine a land divided not by invisible borders on a modern map, but by towering fortresses, rival kings, powerful nobles, and centuries of war. Before Spain became one of history's greatest empires, before ships crossed the Atlantic in search of unknown lands, before silver poured from the mountains of the Americas and connected continents through trade, there was only a peninsula where kingdoms struggled to survive. The story of the Spanish Empire does not begin with Christopher Columbus. It does not begin with gold, conquest, or overseas colonies. It begins hundreds of years earlier, in a land where the future of Europe itself remained uncertain. For centuries, the Iberian Peninsula was a meeting place of civilizations. Mountains divided regions. Rivers created natural frontiers. Fertile valleys supported thriving communities. Along its coasts, merchants connected Europe with Africa and the Mediterranean world. Long before the emergence of Spain, the peninsula had already witnessed the rise and fall of many cultures. Romans had built roads and cities. Visigoths had ruled after the collapse of Roman authority. Then, during the early 8th century, armies from North Africa crossed the narrow Strait of Gibraltar and transformed the history of the peninsula forever. Within only a few years, Muslim forces conquered most of Iberia. The new rulers established Al-Andalus, one of the most remarkable societies of the medieval world. Cities expanded. Agriculture flourished through sophisticated irrigation systems. Scholars translated ancient texts. Physicians, mathematicians, astronomers, philosophers, and architects produced works that would influence both the Islamic world and Christian Europe. Córdoba became one of the largest and most prosperous cities anywhere on Earth. Travelers described libraries containing hundreds of thousands of books at a time, when many European cities possessed only a handful of manuscripts. Yet Al-Andalus was never the whole story. Far to the north, among rugged mountains and narrow valleys, several Christian kingdoms survived. Their existence was often fragile. Sometimes they fought each other. Sometimes they negotiated with Muslim rulers. Sometimes they formed alliances across religious boundaries. The medieval Iberian Peninsula was not simply divided into two permanent camps. Politics were far more complicated. Christian kings occasionally allied with Muslim rulers against rival Christian kingdoms. Muslim leaders sometimes sought Christian allies during their own internal conflicts. Loyalty often followed political necessity more than religious identity. Over generations, however, a long process gradually reshaped the peninsula. Later historians would call it the Reconquista, the Reconquest, rather than one continuous war lasting hundreds of years. It was a series of campaigns, truces, negotiations, marriages, and shifting alliances stretching across centuries. Borders moved slowly. Castles changed hands repeatedly. Entire regions experienced alternating periods of conflict and coexistence. Among the northern kingdoms, two would eventually emerge as the dominant powers: Castile and Aragon. Each developed in very different ways. Castile grew out of a frontier society. Even its name reflected its character. Derived from the word for castles, Castile became known for its network of defensive fortifications built along contested borders. Life on this frontier demanded military organization, resilience, and constant readiness. Nobles gained influence through warfare. Settlers received privileges in exchange for defending newly conquered lands. expansion became deeply woven into the kingdom's political culture. As generations passed, Castile steadily pushed southward. Cities that had once stood firmly within Muslim territory gradually came under Christian rule. Important centers such as Toledo, Córdoba, Jaén, and Seville eventually became part of Castilian territory after prolonged campaigns. Every victory expanded agricultural lands, increased tax revenues, and strengthened royal authority. At the same time, conquered populations often continued living in these regions, creating societies where Christians, Muslims, and Jews lived alongside one another under changing political circumstances. While Castile looked primarily toward the interior of the peninsula, Aragon followed a different path. Situated along the Mediterranean coast, Aragon developed into a maritime kingdom. Through dynastic marriages and commercial expansion, it gained influence across the western Mediterranean. The union between the Kingdom of Aragon and the County of Barcelona created a political partnership that opened new possibilities. Merchants sailed between ports linking Iberia with Sicily, Sardinia, southern Italy, and beyond. Trade shaped Aragon's outlook. Its cities became centers of commerce. Its rulers invested in naval power. Its diplomats built relationships across the Mediterranean world. Unlike Castile's emphasis on frontier warfare, Aragon cultivated an identity closely connected to maritime trade and overseas influence. By the 15th century, both kingdoms had become powerful in their own right. Yet they remained separate states. Each possessed its own laws, its own institutions, its own courts, its own traditions. No single country called Spain yet existed. That would begin to change through one marriage. In the year 1469, Prince Ferdinand of Aragon married Princess Isabella of Castile. At first glance, it appeared to be another dynastic union among European royal families. History would prove otherwise. Their marriage did not erase the distinction between their kingdoms. Castile and Aragon continued operating under separate legal systems. Taxes remained different. Local institutions continued functioning independently. Even after marriage, Ferdinand ruled Aragon according to Aragonese traditions, while Isabella governed Castile according to Castilian customs. Yet politically, something entirely new had emerged. For the first time, the two strongest Christian kingdoms on the peninsula worked together under one royal partnership. Their cooperation dramatically altered the balance of power across Iberia. Ferdinand and Isabella shared ambitions extending far beyond preserving existing borders. They sought stronger royal authority, greater political stability, religious unity, and territorial expansion. At the time they assumed power, one Muslim kingdom still remained independent: Granada. Protected by mountains and sustained by prosperous agriculture, Granada had survived for more than 2 centuries after neighboring Muslim territories had fallen. Its magnificent Alhambra Palace overlooked the city as both a royal residence and a symbol of enduring Islamic civilization in Iberia. For Ferdinand and Isabella, Granada represented unfinished business. Its continued independence challenged their vision of a unified Christian peninsula. The campaign against Granada lasted roughly 10 years. It demanded enormous financial resources, careful military planning, extensive logistics, and sustained cooperation between Castile and Aragon. The war demonstrated just how much stronger the combined monarchy had become. Town after town gradually surrendered. Fortresses changed hands. Supply routes tightened around the emirate. Eventually, only Granada itself remained. In January 1492, after lengthy negotiations, the city surrendered. The last Nasrid ruler, Muhammad XII, known in many Spanish sources as Boabdil, handed over the keys to the city. The event marked the end of Muslim political rule in Iberia after nearly 8 centuries. It carried enormous symbolic significance. Across Christian Europe, the victory was celebrated as the culmination of generations of struggle. For Ferdinand and Isabella, it confirmed their growing reputation as defenders of the Catholic faith. The Pope later granted them the title of Catholic monarchs, reinforcing the close relationship between the Spanish crown and the Church. Yet the year 1492 did not end with the fall of Granada. In many ways, it was only beginning. Within months, the monarchy made another decision that would permanently reshape Spanish society. In March, Ferdinand and Isabella issued what became known as the Alhambra Decree. The order required Jewish communities within Castile and Aragon either to convert to Christianity or leave the kingdoms. For centuries, Jewish communities had contributed to commerce, scholarship, medicine, administration, and finance throughout Iberia. Some families chose conversion. Others departed for Portugal, North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and other regions willing to receive them. The consequences reached far beyond individual lives. Entire communities disappeared. Commercial networks changed. Centuries of intellectual tradition were disrupted. The decision reflected the monarchy's growing commitment to religious uniformity as a pillar of political authority. Another institution reinforced this goal: the Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478 with papal approval but operating under strong royal influence. It investigated converts suspected of secretly practicing Judaism or Islam. Over time, its authority expanded. Its proceedings became closely associated with enforcing religious conformity throughout the emerging Spanish monarchy. These developments often shape modern discussions of Spain during this period. Yet to understand the monarchy's decisions, it is important to recognize the broader context. Late medieval Europe frequently linked political stability with religious unity. Many rulers believed internal divisions weakened kingdoms. Ferdinand and Isabella viewed religious conformity not only as a matter of faith, but also as a tool of state building. Whether that goal justified the human consequences remains one of history's enduring debates. As these transformations unfolded across Iberia, another proposal reached the royal court. Its author was not Spanish. He came from the Republic of Genoa. His name was Christopher Columbus. For years he had argued that Asia could be reached by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean. Portugal had declined to support his calculations. Several advisors questioned his estimates of Earth size. Many believed the journey would simply be too long. But circumstances had changed. The costly war against Granada had ended. The monarchy had demonstrated its military strength. Attention now turned toward new opportunities. Portugal already dominated exploration along the African coast. If Spain hoped to compete, it needed a different route. Columbus offered exactly that possibility. After prolonged negotiations, Ferdinand and Isabella agreed to finance the expedition. Few people present could have imagined that this decision would eventually connect Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas in ways never before seen. The voyage itself would change not only Spain's future, it would change the history of the entire world. When Christopher Columbus left the port of Palos in August of 1492, Neither he nor the people who watched his ships disappear over the horizon could fully understand what had just begun. Europe had known the Atlantic for centuries. Fishermen sailed its coastal waters. Merchants crossed parts of it. Explorers had reached islands far from the mainland. But the vast ocean stretching westward remained one of the greatest unknown spaces on Earth. Maps ended where certainty ended. Beyond them lay speculation, rumors, and imagination. Columbus believed that by sailing west he would reach Asia. His calculations underestimated the true size of the planet. He expected to encounter the wealthy markets of China, Japan, and India. Instead, fate carried him somewhere entirely different. His small fleet consisted of 3 ships: the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, compared with the enormous vessels that would later cross the Atlantic carrying soldiers, missionaries, merchants, and settlers. These ships were remarkably modest. Their crews numbered fewer than 100 men altogether. Every decision depended upon favorable winds, careful navigation, and the confidence of sailors who increasingly wondered whether they would ever see home again. After stopping in the Canary Islands for repairs and supplies, the expedition turned west into waters no European expedition had previously crossed so deliberately. Day after day, the horizon remained unchanged. Only ocean surrounded them. The further they sailed, the greater the uncertainty became. Some crew members worried they had gone too far. Others feared the winds pushing them west might never allow them to return east. Columbus remained determined. He carefully managed morale. He kept detailed records. Some historians believe he even maintained 2 different logs, one showing the true distance traveled and another reporting shorter distances to reduce growing anxiety among the crew. Whether entirely accurate or not, contemporary accounts leave little doubt that tension steadily increased during the crossing. Then, during the early hours of October 12, 1492, everything changed. Land appeared. An island emerged from the darkness. Columbus stepped ashore carrying royal banners and formally claimed the island for the crown of Castile. The island was known to its inhabitants as Guanahani. Columbus renamed it San Salvador. He believed he had reached islands near Asia. The people he encountered seemed unfamiliar to European observers, but Columbus interpreted everything through the geographical assumptions he already held. Believing he had reached the Indies, he referred to the inhabitants as Indians. The name endured for centuries despite resting upon a geographical misunderstanding. The people Columbus encountered belonged to the Taino culture, whose communities extended across much of the Caribbean. Their villages practiced agriculture, fishing, and trade. They cultivated crops well adapted to tropical conditions. They navigated surrounding waters with remarkable skill. Their societies possessed their own political leaders, spiritual traditions, and systems of exchange long before Europeans arrived. Initial encounters varied from place to place. Some involved cautious curiosity. Others involved gift exchanges. Columbus described many of the islanders as welcoming and generous. At the same time, his journals reveal another recurring observation. He repeatedly evaluated whether the local population might be useful as laborers or converts to Christianity. Even during these first encounters, exploration, religion, and imperial ambition were becoming closely intertwined. Columbus continued exploring neighboring islands. He reached parts of present-day Cuba. He later arrived on the island Europeans named Hispaniola, today divided between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. There he encountered larger settlements and regional leaders whose authority extended across surrounding communities. Near the end of the voyage, disaster struck. The Santa Maria ran aground on Christmas Day. Unable to repair the vessel, Columbus ordered much of its timber salvaged. Using those materials, his crew constructed a small settlement called La Navidad. A small group of Spaniards remained behind, while Columbus prepared to return to Europe with the remaining ships. When he finally reached Spain in early 1493, his arrival generated extraordinary interest. He brought unfamiliar plants, colorful birds, objects crafted by indigenous peoples, several captives, and stories describing lands that appeared unlike anything Europeans had previously imagined. The Catholic monarchs welcomed him with ceremony. Although Columbus had not reached Asia as promised, something potentially even greater had emerged. An entirely new sphere of expansion seemed to lie open before the Spanish crown. Success immediately encouraged larger ambitions. The first voyage had been primarily exploratory. The second would be something entirely different. Instead of 3 ships, 17 sailed westward. Instead of fewer than 100 men, more than 1,000 people joined the expedition. Soldiers boarded the vessels. Priests accompanied them. Farmers, craftsmen, administrators, settlers, families hoping to build new lives. This was no longer simply a voyage of discovery. It marked the beginning of permanent colonization. The Spanish crown intended to establish lasting authority across the newly claimed territories. Upon returning to Hispaniola, however, Columbus discovered troubling news. The settlement of La Navidad no longer existed. The Spaniards left behind after the first voyage had all died. Historical evidence suggests that deteriorating relations with local communities, internal disputes, and the settlers' own behavior contributed to the colony's destruction. Whatever the precise sequence of events, one lesson became immediately clear. Maintaining a permanent colony required far more than planting a flag. Spain responded by establishing a new settlement. It became known as La Isabella. Named in honor of Queen Isabella, it represented Europe's first permanent colonial town in the Americas. Its construction required enormous effort. Forests had to be cleared, buildings raised, food secured, fields cultivated, livestock introduced. Yet almost immediately, serious problems appeared. The settlers struggled to adapt. Many expected easy wealth. Instead, they found unfamiliar climates, difficult labor, disease, shortages, and constant uncertainty. Agriculture developed more slowly than anticipated. Supplies from Spain often arrived irregularly. Tropical illnesses weakened many colonists. Meanwhile, relationships with the Taino deteriorated rapidly. Spanish demands increased. Food, labor, gold, tribute. What had begun with exchanges of gifts increasingly gave way to unequal power. The search for gold became especially important. The crown expected profitable returns. Colonists expected fortunes. Columbus organized expeditions across the island searching for precious metals. Where little gold appeared, pressure upon indigenous communities intensified. Tribute systems emerged requiring local populations to deliver specified quantities of resources. Failure often brought punishment. At the same time, epidemic diseases spread through communities with devastating speed. Smallpox would later become the most infamous, But other illnesses also proved catastrophic. Having lived in isolation from Eurasian disease environments for thousands of years, indigenous populations possessed no inherited immunity against many infections Europeans unknowingly carried. The consequences unfolded with heartbreaking speed. Entire villages experienced devastating mortality. Communities lost elders, leaders, farmers, craftsmen, parents, children. Disease alone does not explain the tragedy. Forced labor, violence, displacement, food shortages, social disruption, all compounded the suffering. Modern historians generally agree that the demographic collapse of the Caribbean ranks among the greatest population disasters in recorded history. Columbus himself soon became a controversial figure even among fellow Spaniards. Complaints reached the royal court. Settlers criticized his administration. Some accused him of authoritarian rule. Others questioned his management of colonial affairs. Royal investigators eventually traveled to Hispaniola. Columbus was arrested. For a time, he returned to Spain in chains. Although the monarchy later restored some of his honors and permitted additional voyages, he never again exercised the same authority over colonial government. The crown had learned another important lesson. Private adventurers might conquer new territories, but lasting empire required direct royal administration. As settlement expanded, Spain searched for ways to organize labor. One institution soon became central to colonial society: the encomienda. Under this arrangement, the crown granted certain Spaniards the right to receive labor or tribute from designated indigenous communities. In return, the recipient supposedly accepted obligations. They were expected to provide protection, religious instruction, and support for those communities. In practice, reality frequently differed from theory. Many encomenderos exploited indigenous labor intensively. Mining, agriculture, construction, transport. Demand for labor expanded continuously. Abuses became widespread. Not every colonial official approved. Not every missionary remained silent. Some members of the church began questioning what they witnessed. Among the most influential voices was Bartolomé de las Casas. Originally an encomendero himself, he later became a Dominican friar. After observing conditions firsthand, he underwent a profound change of perspective. He argued passionately that indigenous peoples possessed the same humanity and dignity as Europeans. He condemned cruelty, forced labor, and violence. His writings reached the Spanish court and eventually influenced debates over colonial policy for generations. His criticisms did not immediately transform colonial society, but they introduced moral questions that would continue shaping discussions about empire long after the first conquests ended. While Hispaniola remained the center of Spanish activity, exploration continued. Ships sailed toward neighboring islands. New settlements appeared. Attention increasingly turned toward Cuba. In 1511, Diego Velázquez de Cuellar led an expedition that established Spanish authority across much of the island. Like Hispaniola before it, Cuba possessed fertile agricultural lands and strategic harbors. Its location quickly made it one of the empire's most valuable possessions. Among the settlements founded during these years was Havana. Few people could yet imagine how important that city would become. Its natural harbor offered exceptional protection. Its location placed it directly along routes connecting the Caribbean with the Atlantic. Eventually, fleets carrying silver from the Americas would gather there before making the dangerous crossing back to Spain. Havana would grow into one of the empire's most important naval and commercial centers. Spanish expansion soon reached Puerto Rico as well. Juan Ponce de Leon established colonial control during the opening years of the 16th century. The island followed patterns already emerging elsewhere. Missionaries arrived. Colonial officials organized administration. Settlers demanded labor. Indigenous populations suffered severe demographic decline. Across the Caribbean, similar systems gradually took shape. Royal authority expanded. Church institutions spread. European livestock transformed landscapes. Cattle grazed where none had existed before. Horses altered transportation. Pigs multiplied rapidly. Sheep and goats changed local agriculture. European crops accompanied them. Wheat, sugarcane, citrus fruits. Each arrival reshaped environments that had developed independently for thousands of years. The Caribbean also became a laboratory for imperial government. Officials experimented with administration, taxation, missionary work, military organization, urban planning. Practices first developed on these islands would later be carried onto the American mainland. They became the foundation of a much larger empire still waiting beyond the horizon. Meanwhile, stories reached the Caribbean from traders, sailors, and indigenous intermediaries. They spoke of enormous lands far beyond the islands, powerful rulers, great cities, markets overflowing with goods, temples rising above crowded populations, and wealth unlike anything yet encountered. Some dismissed the stories as exaggeration. Others listened carefully. Among those listening was a man living in Cuba. His name was Hernán Cortés. The decisions he made next would change the course of history for Spain, for the Americas, and for the world. By the second decade of the 16th century, the Caribbean had become more than Spain's first colonial foothold. It had become a launching point. Every expedition that returned carried new rumors. Sailors spoke about rivers wider than any they had seen before. Traders repeated stories of wealthy kingdoms hidden beyond the coastline. Indigenous peoples described rulers who commanded thousands of warriors and cities whose markets overflowed with goods from distant regions. Not every tale was accurate, but together they created a powerful belief that somewhere on the mainland existed civilizations richer than anything the islands could offer. Among the men who heard these reports was Hernán Cortés. He had arrived in the Caribbean years earlier seeking opportunity rather than noble titles. Like many young men from the Spanish region of Extremadura, he came from a family with respectable origins but limited wealth. The expanding overseas world offered possibilities unavailable at home. Through service in Hispaniola and later during the conquest of Cuba under Diego Velázquez, Cortés accumulated land, influence, and experience. Yet none of that satisfied his ambition. When reports of the mainland multiplied, he became convinced that the greatest opportunities still lay ahead. Governor Diego Velázquez authorized an expedition to explore the Mexican coast. Almost immediately, however, relations between the governor and Cortés deteriorated. Velázquez began questioning whether Cortés might become too independent. Orders were issued attempting to cancel the expedition before it departed. Cortés ignored them. In early 1519, he sailed anyway. The decision was risky. Technically, he had defied his superior. If the expedition failed, he could expect severe punishment. If it succeeded, the rewards might outweigh every danger. His fleet consisted of 11 ships, around 600 soldiers, a handful of horses, several small cannons, crossbows, arquebus, steel swords. The force was tiny by the standards of the civilizations it was about to encounter. Its success would depend on much more than weapons alone. When the expedition reached the Gulf Coast, Cortés immediately recognized an important political reality. Military victory alone would never be enough. He needed allies. The societies of central Mexico were not politically united. At their center stood the Mexica people, known today more commonly as the Aztecs. From their magnificent capital of Tenochtitlan, they ruled an extensive empire through tribute, military strength, and political influence. Many neighboring peoples respected Aztec power. Others deeply resented it. Year after year, they delivered tribute. Food, textiles, luxury goods, captives. Some had endured repeated military campaigns, forcing them into submission. Cortés quickly realized these resentments could become his greatest advantage. Rather than attempting to conquer the region alone, he negotiated with communities dissatisfied with Aztec dominance. One of the first important alliances developed with the Totonacs. Later came an even more significant partnership, the Tlaxcalans. Initially, the Tlaxcalans fought fiercely against the Spaniards. Several battles demonstrated just how dangerous they could be. Eventually, however, both sides reached an agreement. The Tlaxcalans understood that cooperation with the newcomers might finally allow them to challenge their powerful neighbors. For Cortés, the alliance transformed the balance of power. Instead of commanding only a few hundred Europeans, he now marched alongside thousands of indigenous allies. This fact remains essential to understanding the conquest. The fall of the Aztec Empire was not achieved by Spaniards acting alone. Thousands upon thousands of indigenous warriors participated, each pursuing their own political objectives. Another individual soon proved equally indispensable. A young woman remembered by history as Malintzin. Spanish sources often called her Dona Marina after her baptism. She's also widely known as La Malinche. Born into a Nahua-speaking community, she had experienced slavery before being presented to the Spaniards. Her linguistic abilities made her invaluable. She spoke both Nahuatl and Maya. Through another interpreter who knew Maya and Spanish, communication became possible. Soon Malintzin herself learned Spanish with remarkable speed. She became far more than a translator. She explained political relationships, cultural customs, diplomatic expectations. She advised Cortés during negotiations, warned him of potential dangers, helped build alliances. Her role remains one of the most debated in Mexican history. For some generations, she became portrayed as a symbol of betrayal. For others, she represented a woman navigating impossible circumstances within a world transformed by forces beyond her control. Modern historians increasingly emphasize her complexity rather than simplistic labels. As Cortés advanced inland, the landscape changed dramatically. The humid coastal plains gradually gave way to mountain valleys. Cities appeared connected by well-maintained roads. Agricultural terraces covered hillsides. Markets bustled with activity. Far from encountering scattered villages, the Spaniards found highly organized societies supported by sophisticated political institutions. The closer they came to the Aztec heartland, the more evidence they saw of imperial authority. Tribute collectors, military garrisons, ceremonial centers. Everything pointed toward an exceptionally powerful state. Then, after weeks of travel, they reached one of history's most astonishing cities, Tenochtitlan. Built upon islands within Lake Texcoco, the city seemed almost unreal to European eyes. Long causeways connected it to the mainland. Canals crossed neighborhoods. Bridges controlled access. Large markets attracted merchants from across Mesoamerica. Temples towered above surrounding buildings. Aqueducts supplied fresh water. Engineers had created artificial agricultural islands, known as chinampas, that produced abundant harvests. Contemporary Spanish observers struggled to describe what they saw. Several compared it favorably with Europe's greatest cities. Some later admitted they had never imagined such urban sophistication could exist outside the Old World. Waiting within the city was Emperor Moctezuma II. His position was extraordinarily difficult. Reports reaching him described strangers unlike anyone previously encountered. Men wearing shining metal armor. Mounted warriors riding unknown animals. Weapons producing thunder and smoke. But perhaps even more troubling were reports that numerous indigenous communities had chosen to support these newcomers. Moctezuma faced uncertainty. He possessed overwhelming numerical superiority, yet he lacked reliable information. Later stories claimed he believed the Spaniards were returning gods. Modern historians generally reject that simple explanation. Contemporary evidence suggests a far more cautious and politically complex response. Moctezuma likely viewed Cortés as an unpredictable foreign leader whose intentions remained uncertain. Rather than immediately launching a massive attack, he chose diplomacy. In November 1519, Cortés entered Tenochtitlan. The meeting between the two leaders became one of history's defining encounters. Magnificent ceremonies welcomed the Spaniards. Gifts were exchanged. Formal speeches delivered. Yet beneath every gesture lay mutual suspicion. Neither side fully understood the other's intentions. Neither trusted the other completely. Within days, Cortés made an astonishing decision. He seized Moctezuma. The emperor remained physically alive, but effectively became a prisoner inside his own palace. Cortés hoped to govern through him. As long as the emperor obeyed Spanish demands, perhaps the empire itself could be controlled without large-scale war. For several months, this fragile arrangement survived. Spanish soldiers occupied sections of the city. Moctezuma attempted to calm his people. Tension steadily increased. Meanwhile, events elsewhere threatened everything. Governor Velázquez had not forgotten Cortés. Determined to reassert authority, he dispatched another expedition under Panfilo de Narvaez. Its mission was straightforward: arrest Cortés. In his unauthorized campaign, Cortés faced an impossible choice: remain in Tenochtitlan and risk arrest, or leave the city while trusting a small garrison to maintain control. He chose the second option. Marching to the coast, he confronted Narvaez. Against considerable odds, Cortés defeated the larger expedition. Many of Narvaez's soldiers switched sides and joined him. Militarily, it was a remarkable success. But while Cortés celebrated victory on the coast, disaster unfolded in Tenochtitlan. During a major religious festival, Spanish soldiers remaining in the city attacked participants gathered in one of the ceremonial courtyards. The reasons remain debated. Some accounts suggest fear of rebellion. Others point toward greed for ceremonial ornaments made from precious metals. Whatever motivated the decision, the result proved catastrophic. Hundreds died. The massacre shattered any remaining trust. The city erupted. The population rose against the occupiers. When Cortés hurried back, he discovered his position had collapsed. The Spaniards were trapped. Street fighting intensified. Food supplies dwindled. Moctezuma himself died during the crisis. Exactly how he died remains uncertain. Spanish sources claim stones thrown by his own people fatally wounded him while attempting to calm the crowds. Other traditions argued the Spaniards killed him after realizing he no longer served their purposes. The historical evidence does not permit a definitive conclusion. With the city fully hostile, escape became the only option. During the night of June 30th, 1520, the Spaniards attempted to flee across one of the causeways. The retreat became legendary. Heavy rain, darkness, confusion. Aztec warriors attacked relentlessly from canoes and rooftops. Many Spaniards, burdened by stolen gold, drowned after falling into the lake. Others were captured. Thousands of indigenous allies also lost their lives. The retreat entered history as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows. According to tradition, Cortés later paused beneath a tree and wept over the disaster. Whether literally true or not, the story reflects the scale of defeat. Everything appeared lost. Yet the campaign was not over. Instead of abandoning Mexico, Cortés rebuilt. He strengthened alliances, gathered reinforcements, constructed brigantines, small sailing vessels designed for warfare on the lake itself. Meanwhile, another invisible force spread through central Mexico. Smallpox. Introduced inadvertently from Europe, the disease moved rapidly through populations lacking prior exposure. Communities already struggling with war now faced epidemic catastrophe. Leaders died. Warriors perished. Families collapsed. Among the victims was the new Emperor Cuitlahuac. The epidemic severely weakened the empire at precisely the moment it most needed stability. In 1521, Cortés returned. This time he did not seek negotiation. He prepared for siege. Spanish brigantines gained control of the lake. Causeways were attacked. Aqueducts cut. Supplies blocked. Thousands of Tlaxcalan and other indigenous allies surrounded the city. House by house, canal by canal, district by district. The fighting continued for months. Starvation spread. Disease intensified suffering. Resistance nevertheless remained determined under the leadership of the final emperor, Cuauhtémoc. Eventually, however, exhaustion overcame even the strongest defenders. On August 13th, 1521, Cuauhtémoc was captured while attempting to escape across the lake. The organized defense ended. Tenochtitlan had fallen. What followed marked the birth of New Spain. The destruction was immense. Large sections of the city lay in ruins after months of combat. Many temples were dismantled. Stones from indigenous buildings became foundations for new colonial structures. Churches rose where ceremonial centers had once stood. Administrative buildings replaced imperial palaces. Yet the new colonial capital also preserved much of the city's remarkable urban layout. Mexico City grew directly upon the foundations of Tenochtitlan. Today, beneath modern streets, archaeologists continue uncovering the remains of the former imperial capital, reminding the world that the colonial city never entirely erased what came before. News of the conquest crossed the Atlantic with astonishing speed. Europe reacted with amazement. Reports described wealthy cities, powerful emperors, gold, complex civilizations. For the Spanish crown, the implications were enormous. The Americas were not merely distant islands. They contained organized states capable of producing immense wealth. Future expeditions would become larger, more ambitious, more systematic. Yet another empire still lay far to the south, high among the Andes Mountains. Its roads stretched for thousands of kilometers. Its rulers governed millions. Its wealth became the subject of growing rumors among Spanish explorers. Its name was Tawantinsuyo, the Inca Empire, and before long, another ambitious conquistador named Francisco Pizarro would begin marching toward it. The news that reached the Caribbean and Spain after the conquest of the Aztec Empire transformed the ambitions of countless men. Mexico had revealed that the American mainland contained powerful civilizations with organized governments, thriving cities, and immense wealth. The conquest also demonstrated something that few Europeans had imagined possible. A relatively small Spanish force, supported by thousands of indigenous allies and aided by extraordinary circumstances, had overthrown one of the most powerful states in the Americas. That success inspired others. Across the growing Spanish Empire, stories began circulating about another kingdom even richer than the Aztecs. Travelers spoke of roads stretching across mountains, temples decorated with gold, rulers whose authority extended over enormous territories. Most of these stories referred to the Inca Empire. Its people called it Tawantinsuyo, the land of four quarters. At its height, it stretched along the spine of the Andes for thousands of kilometers. From present-day Ecuador through Peru and into Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina, the empire connected mountains, deserts, forests, and valleys through one of the most remarkable administrative systems ever created in the pre-Columbian Americas. Its capital stood high in the mountains, Cusco. According to Inca tradition, it was the center of the world. Roads radiated outward in every direction. Bridges crossed deep gorges. Storehouses lined important routes. Messengers known as chasquis carried information across astonishing distances with remarkable speed. Without wheeled vehicles or horses, the empire maintained communication across some of the most difficult terrain on Earth. The man who would eventually lead the Spanish expedition southward was Francisco Pizarro. Unlike many famous rulers of his age, Pizarro was born into modest circumstances. He came from the town of Trujillo in western Spain around the year 1474. He was the illegitimate son of a military officer. His formal education appears to have been limited. Like many others from Extremadura, he looked beyond Europe for opportunity. The Americas promised fortunes unavailable at home. Pizarro participated in early colonial ventures in the Caribbean before joining Vasco Núñez de Balboa's famous expedition across the Isthmus of Panama. In 1513, Balboa became the first European known to reach the Pacific Ocean from the American side. Standing before the vast sea, the explorers heard new stories. Far to the south, indigenous peoples described another wealthy civilization. Those rumors stayed with Pizarro for years. His first attempts to reach the region ended badly. Storms battered his ships. Food became scarce. Disease spread among his men. Some expeditions returned with little to show for months of hardship. Many leaders would have abandoned the dream. Pizarro did not. During later journeys, his expeditions encountered coastal communities that possessed finely crafted textiles, carefully worked metal objects, and ornaments made from gold and silver. These discoveries convinced him that the rumors contained truth. Returning to Spain, Pizarro sought royal authorization. The crown approved his proposal. He received permission to conquer and govern lands yet to come under Spanish authority. Armed with official backing, he returned across the Atlantic. In 1532, his expedition finally moved inland. Compared with the empire ahead, his force remained astonishingly small. Fewer than 200 Spaniards, a few dozen horses, several small cannons, firearms, steel weapons. On paper, they possessed almost no chance against an empire numbering millions. Yet once again, circumstances favored them in unexpected ways. Before Pizarro ever reached the Andes, disease had already arrived. Smallpox, introduced through earlier European contact elsewhere in the Americas, spread southward faster than explorers themselves. The epidemic struck the Inca Empire before Spaniards appeared. Among its victims was Emperor Huayna Capac. His death created a succession crisis. Two sons emerged as rivals, Huáscar and Atahualpa. Their struggle for power escalated into civil war. For years, armies fought across the empire. Cities changed hands. Families divided their loyalties. Resources were consumed. Eventually, Atahualpa emerged victorious. But victory came at tremendous cost. The empire had survived. Its unity had not. Pizarro entered this fragile political landscape at exactly the right moment. When news reached Atahualpa about strange foreigners approaching, he was camped near the town of Cajamarca. Fresh from civil war, he commanded thousands of experienced soldiers. Numerically, the Spaniards represented almost no threat. Atahualpa nevertheless agreed to meet them. His decision remains one of history's most debated moments. Some historians believe he wished to observe the newcomers before deciding how to respond. Others argue he underestimated them completely. Whatever his reasoning, he entered Cajamarca with a ceremonial escort rather than preparing for battle. Pizarro had already planned something very different. His men concealed themselves around the town square. Horses waited behind buildings. Cannons were positioned. When Atahualpa arrived, a Dominican friar approached carrying a Bible and attempted to explain Christianity and Spanish authority. Exactly what happened next remains uncertain because surviving accounts differ considerably. Spanish chroniclers later claimed Atahualpa rejected the message. Indigenous traditions preserved different versions. Whatever the precise sequence, violence erupted almost immediately. Cannons fired. Horsemen charged. Steel weapons flashed. Panic swept through the crowded square. The Inca attendants had entered largely unarmed for a ceremonial meeting. They found themselves trapped. Thousands died within hours. The Spaniards suffered almost no casualties. Most importantly, Atahualpa himself was captured. The consequences proved enormous. In the political culture of the Inca Empire, the emperor stood at the center of government, religion, and administration. With him imprisoned, confusion spread rapidly. Officials hesitated. Generals delayed action. No one knew how to respond. Pizarro immediately recognized the value of his prisoner. Atahualpa understood his own importance as well. Hoping to secure release, he proposed one of history's most extraordinary ransoms. He promised to fill a large room with gold, then fill it twice again with silver. Messengers traveled across the empire. Temple ornaments, ceremonial vessels, jewelry, statues, decorative objects, precious works created over generations. They arrived in Cajamarca piece by piece. Spanish soldiers watched in amazement as unimaginable wealth accumulated before them. The treasure was eventually melted down. Artistic masterpieces disappeared forever. Their cultural significance mattered little to men focused upon bullion. Gold became bars. Silver became ingots. Everything was divided according to established rules. The crown received its royal fifth. Officers collected large shares. Ordinary soldiers became wealthier than they had ever imagined possible. Yet despite receiving the ransom, Pizarro did not release Atahualpa. Instead, the emperor was placed on trial. The accusations included idolatry, treason, fratricide, conspiracy. The proceedings reflected Spanish legal concepts rather than Inca traditions. The outcome had largely been decided before they began. In July 1533, Atahualpa was executed. Initially sentenced to death by burning, he accepted baptism shortly before his execution. As a baptized Christian, he was instead strangled with a garrote. His death removed the last universally recognized authority capable of uniting the empire. From that moment onward, Spanish conquest accelerated. Pizarro advanced toward Cusco. Along the way, many communities chose cooperation. Some hoped Spanish intervention would free them from former imperial obligations. Others simply wished to avoid destruction. Not every alliance reflected enthusiasm for Spanish rule. Many represented practical decisions made during extraordinary uncertainty. Late in 1533, the Spaniards entered Cusco. The capital astonished them. Its carefully fitted stone walls displayed engineering precision that continues to impress visitors today. Temples, palaces, administrative buildings, roads, storehouses. Everything reflected generations of sophisticated planning. The Temple of the Sun, known as Coricancha, stood among the empire's most sacred places. Its walls had once been covered with sheets of gold. Much of that treasure disappeared into Spanish furnaces. Pizarro attempted to govern through puppet rulers, much as Cortés had initially done in Mexico. One young prince, Manco Inca Yupanqui, accepted the position. For a time, cooperation seemed possible. Eventually, however, Manco recognized the growing reality. Spanish rule threatened the independence of his people. In 1536, he launched a massive uprising. Thousands of warriors surrounded Cusco. For months, fierce fighting engulfed the city. At one point, Spanish defeat appeared entirely possible. The defenders survived only through determined resistance and support from indigenous allies. Unable to recapture the capital, Manco retreated into the remote mountain region of Vilcabamba. There, an independent neo-Inca state continued resisting Spanish rule for decades. The conquest of Peru, therefore, did not end in one dramatic victory. Resistance continued. Negotiations continued. Conflict continued. Even after the fall of Cusco, complete Spanish control remained years away. Meanwhile, conflict erupted among the conquerors themselves. Success had created new problems. Who deserved the greatest rewards? Who would govern? Who owned which territories? Pizarro and his longtime associate Diego de Almagro disagreed bitterly. Their rivalry escalated into open war. In 1538, Pizarro's supporters defeated Almagro. Almagro was executed. 3 years later, his followers entered Pizarro's residence in Lima. They assassinated him. The conqueror of Peru died not at indigenous hands, but during a struggle among Spaniards competing for power. The crown viewed these events with growing concern. Individual conquistadors had proven capable of extraordinary military achievements. They had also demonstrated dangerous independence. The monarchy therefore moved decisively to strengthen royal authority. New administrative institutions appeared. Royal officials arrived. The era when individual conquerors exercised almost unrestricted power gradually came to an end. One development transformed Peru into the economic heart of the empire. In 1545, indigenous workers discovered an immense silver deposit at Potosí in present-day Bolivia. The mountain quickly became legendary. Europeans called it Cerro Rico, the rich mountain. Its silver production reached astonishing levels. 4 generations, ships carried its wealth across the Atlantic. The impact extended far beyond Spain. Silver minted in the Americas eventually circulated through Europe. The Ottoman Empire, India, China. It financed wars, purchased Asian goods, supported global commerce. Few places illustrate the emergence of an interconnected world more clearly than Potosí. Yet behind that wealth stood enormous human labor. Spanish authorities adapted an existing Inca labor system known as the Mida. Under colonial rule, communities supplied workers for the mines according to assigned quotas. Conditions often proved extremely difficult. High altitude, cold temperatures, long working hours, dangerous tunnels. Mercury used during silver refining created additional health risks. Mortality remained high. Historians continue debating exact figures, but there is broad agreement that mining imposed immense hardship upon indigenous communities across the Andes. While Peru generated extraordinary wealth, the Spanish monarchy also began constructing a more permanent colonial government. Military conquest had opened the door. Administration would keep it open. The crown established the Viceroyalty of Peru. A viceroy governed in the king's name. Royal courts, known as audiencias, administered justice. Officials supervised taxation. Church authorities expanded missionary activity. Cities grew around plazas designed according to Spanish urban planning principles. Lima, founded by Pizarro in 1535 near the Pacific coast, gradually replaced Cusco as the political center of Spanish South America. Its location allowed easier communication with Spain through Pacific and Atlantic shipping routes. Universities, cathedrals, government offices, merchant houses, all followed. Within only a few decades, Spanish authority stretched across enormous distances. From Mexico to Peru, from Caribbean islands to the Pacific coast, the empire now possessed 2 great centers. New Spain in the north, Peru in the south. Both generated wealth. Both became centers of missionary work. Both connected Europe to civilizations previously unknown there. Yet ruling such vast territories presented challenges unlike anything European monarchies had previously faced. How could one king govern lands separated by entire oceans? How could laws reach colonies months away by sea? How could taxes be collected, justice enforced, and royal authority maintained across continents? The answers would shape the next chapter in the history of the Spanish Empire, as the crown began building one of the most sophisticated systems of imperial administration the early modern world had ever seen. Winning battles was only the beginning. The dramatic victories of Hernán Cortés in Mexico and Francisco Pizarro in Peru captured the imagination of Europe, but the Spanish crown understood something the conquistadors themselves sometimes overlooked. An empire could not survive on military success alone. Conquest might open the door. It cannot keep the door open forever. The lands now claimed by Spain stretched across thousands of kilometers. Their populations numbered in the millions. Their climates ranged from tropical forests to frozen mountain peaks. Their people spoke hundreds of different languages. No medieval kingdom had ever attempted to govern territories separated by an entire ocean on such a scale. If Spain hoped to preserve what had been won, it needed institutions capable of turning conquest into administration. It also needed to ensure that no individual conquistador became powerful enough to rival the crown itself. That concern had already become obvious. Cortés had ignored the authority of the governor of Cuba. Pizarro and Diego de Almagro had fought one another for control of Peru. Successful conquerors often viewed themselves not simply as servants of the king, but as men who had earned extraordinary privileges through extraordinary achievements. The monarchy appreciated their victories. It did not intend to surrender control of its empire to them. The first major step came in 1524. King Charles established the Council of the Indies. Located in Spain, the council became the highest administrative body responsible for overseas territories. Its members examined reports arriving from the Americas. They advised the monarch, prepared laws, reviewed appointments, supervised colonial administration, heard legal appeals, and attempted to maintain direct royal authority over lands that many members would never see with their own eyes. The challenge was immense. News traveled only as fast as ships could sail. A letter sent from Mexico or Peru often required months to reach Spain. The reply required months more. By the time instructions arrived, circumstances on the ground might already have changed completely. Colonial officials therefore exercised considerable discretion. Yet the crown continued insisting that ultimate authority belonged to the monarch. To make government more practical, Spain divided its overseas possessions into enormous administrative regions called viceroyalties. The first of these was New Spain. Established in 1535, its capital stood at Mexico City. From there, the viceroy governed far more than modern Mexico. His authority extended across Central America, the Caribbean, much of what is now the southwestern United States, and eventually even the Philippines across the Pacific Ocean. The scale was almost impossible to comprehend. The Viceroyalty of Peru followed in 1542. Its capital, Lima, overlooked the Pacific Ocean. Initially, it controlled nearly all Spanish territory in South America. Only centuries later would additional viceroyalties divide these vast lands into smaller administrative units. The viceroy represented the king himself. His office combined military authority, civil administration, financial oversight, and ceremonial leadership. When the viceroy entered a city, elaborate processions reminded everyone that although the king remained thousands of kilometers away, royal authority was still present. Beneath the viceroys stood an increasingly complex network of officials. Governors managed provinces. Treasury officers collected taxes. Military commanders defended frontiers. Judges administered royal law. Among the most important institutions were the audiencias. These high courts combined judicial and administrative responsibilities. They heard appeals, investigated officials, sometimes even acted as temporary governments when vacancies occurred. In theory, every office served as a check upon another. No official should possess unlimited authority. In practice, personalities, distance, and local politics often complicated these carefully designed arrangements. The crown also remained deeply suspicious of local elites. Many Spaniards born in the Americas accumulated enormous fortunes. These colonial-born Spaniards became known as criollos. Although loyal to the monarchy in many respects, they possessed local connections and economic influence that occasionally worried Madrid. For that reason, many of the highest government positions went instead to peninsulars. These were officials born in Spain itself. The policy reinforced royal control. It also planted seeds of resentment that would grow steadily over the following centuries. Administration alone could not hold the empire together. Religion became equally important. From the earliest voyages, the Spanish monarchy viewed overseas expansion not only as political opportunity, but also as a religious mission. The conversion of indigenous peoples became one of the official justifications for imperial rule. Missionaries accompanied soldiers into newly conquered regions. Franciscans arrived first, soon followed by Dominicans, Augustinians, later Jesuits. Each religious order developed its own methods. Many missionaries learned indigenous languages. They translated prayers, prepared dictionaries, recorded local traditions. Some became remarkably skilled linguists whose writings remain valuable historical sources today. Churches rose across the Americas. Often they occupied places already sacred within indigenous traditions. Cathedrals dominated colonial city centers. Smaller parish churches reached villages throughout the countryside. Mission settlements appeared along frontiers where Spanish military authority remained limited. The church became more than a religious institution. It educated children, maintained hospitals, recorded births, performed marriages, organized charitable assistance, influenced local politics. Its presence reached nearly every corner of colonial society. Yet missionary activity was far from simple. Some priests sincerely defended indigenous communities against exploitation. Others accepted or even supported colonial authority without question. The relationship between church and empire remained deeply intertwined. One figure came to symbolize the moral debates surrounding conquest: Bartolomé de las Casas. After witnessing the treatment of indigenous peoples, he devoted much of his life to advocating reform. He argued before the Spanish court that native peoples possessed rational souls, natural rights, and full humanity. His arguments contributed to one of the most remarkable debates in early modern history. Could conquest itself ever be morally justified? At Valladolid in the 1550s, Las Casas debated the scholar Juan Gines de Sepúlveda. Sepúlveda defended conquest by arguing that Spain brought civilization and Christianity to societies he viewed as inferior. Las Casas vyjekty datrizning. He insisted conversion should occur peacefully rather than through violence. Although no clear official winner emerged, the very existence of such debates demonstrated that questions surrounding empire reached the highest levels of Spanish government. These discussions also influenced legislation. In 1542, King Charles approved the new laws. Their purpose was to reduce abuses within the encomienda system. Among other reforms, they attempted to prevent encomiendas from becoming hereditary possessions. Many conquistadors reacted with fury. Some openly rebelled. In Peru, resistance became so intense that parts of the legislation required modification. Even so, the new laws reflected an important principle. The crown sought greater control over colonial society while limiting the independence of powerful settlers. Economic administration proved equally important. The empire required enormous financial resources. Wars in Europe consumed vast sums. Royal courts demanded revenue. Colonial government itself required funding. The solution centered upon precious metals. Silver flowed from Zacatecas in New Spain. Even greater quantities emerged from Potosí in Peru. Convoys transported bullion to carefully protected ports. Treasure fleets then crossed the Atlantic under heavy naval escort. Pirates, privateers, storms, disease. Every voyage carried danger. To reduce risk, Spain developed the fleet system. Rather than allowing ships to sail individually, merchant vessels traveled together under military protection. Major American ports, such as Veracruz and Cartagena, became gathering points before fleets departed for Europe. On the Spanish side, Seville initially dominated overseas commerce. Later, Cadiz assumed greater importance. Trade remained tightly regulated. Officially, colonial goods could move only through approved ports and licensed merchants. The monarchy believed centralized control would maximize tax revenue and reduce smuggling. Reality proved more complicated. The sheer size of the empire made complete enforcement impossible. Smugglers flourished. Foreign merchants found ways around restrictions. Corruption occasionally reached even senior officials. Nevertheless, the system generated extraordinary wealth. Silver became the lifeblood of Spain's global influence. Much of it never remained in Spain for long. Wars against France, conflicts with the Ottoman Empire, loans from European bankers, purchases of Asian luxury goods, all absorbed enormous quantities of bullion. Spanish-American silver circulated across the world. It reached markets in India, financed trade with China, passed through the hands of merchants from Amsterdam to Istanbul. The empire had become part of a truly global economy. Life within the colonies reflected remarkable diversity. Spanish settlers arrived in growing numbers. Some sought fortunes through mining. Others established cattle ranches. Large agricultural estates, known as haciendas, gradually expanded. Craftsmen opened workshops. Merchants organized commercial networks. Lawyers, teachers, doctors, printers. Colonial cities developed increasingly sophisticated urban societies. At the same time, indigenous communities continued adapting to changing realities. Many retained traditional leadership structures under Spanish supervision. Local nobles often served as intermediaries between colonial officials and indigenous populations. Tribute collection, labor obligations, legal disputes, everything required negotiation. The empire functioned not simply through force, but through countless daily interactions among people with very different backgrounds. Another transformation quietly reshaped colonial society. Families formed across cultural boundaries. Spanish settlers married or formed relationships with indigenous women. Africans brought through the Atlantic slave trade also became part of colonial communities. Over generations, increasingly diverse populations emerged. Colonial authorities attempted to categorize this complexity. Terms such as mestizo described people of Spanish and indigenous ancestry. Mulatto referred generally to people of Spanish and African ancestry. Other labels multiplied as officials tried to classify mixed backgrounds. These categories influence taxation, legal privileges, employment opportunities, social status. Yet everyday life rarely fit neatly within official classifications. Identity remained far more fluid than bureaucratic records suggested. Meanwhile, another labor system expanded. As indigenous populations declined sharply in many regions because of disease, warfare, displacement, and exploitation, colonial economies sought alternative workers. Enslaved Africans were transported across the Atlantic in increasing numbers. Although Spain never dominated the Atlantic slave trade to the same extent as Portugal or Britain would later do, enslaved Africans became essential to many parts of the Spanish colonial economy. They worked on sugar plantations, in ports, mines, households, workshops. They also resisted. Some escaped into remote communities known as palenques. Others negotiated freedom through military service or legal petitions. African traditions blended with indigenous and European influences, helping shape the cultural foundations of Latin America. By the middle of the 16th century, Spain ruled territories unlike anything the world had previously witnessed. The empire stretched across two great continents. Its wealth crossed oceans. Its laws reached lands separated by thousands of kilometers. Its missionaries preached in dozens of languages. Its officials governed peoples with vastly different histories and traditions. Yet the empire continued growing. Its ambitions no longer stopped at the Pacific coast of the Americas. Beyond that immense ocean lay another world. Across the Pacific stood the markets of Asia, the rich trade of China, the islands of Southeast Asia, the legendary Spice Islands. Soon, Spanish ships would sail west once more, this time not in search of another America, but toward Asia itself, completing one of the first truly global empires in human history. By the middle of the 16th century, Spain had accomplished something no kingdom had achieved before. It ruled territories separated not by rivers or mountain ranges, but by entire oceans. From the cities of central Mexico to the silver mines of the Andes, from Caribbean ports to settlements along the Pacific coast, Spanish authority stretched farther than any European monarchy had previously managed. Yet even this remarkable expansion did not satisfy the ambitions of the crown. Beyond the Pacific lay Asia. For centuries, Europeans had sought direct access to its wealth. Silk, porcelain, spices, fine textiles, luxury goods whose value often increased several times between their place of origin and the markets of Europe. Portugal had built an extensive maritime network around Africa and into the Indian Ocean. Its merchants dominated many of the sea routes linking Europe with India and Southeast Asia. Spain needed another path. Ironically, the first great step toward Spanish expansion in Asia came through a voyage led by a man who was not Spanish at all. His name was Ferdinand Magellan. Born in Portugal, Magellan had served the Portuguese crown before disagreements ended his career there. Convinced that a western route to the Spice Islands existed, he offered his services to Spain. King Charles accepted the proposal. In 1519, 5 ships departed from Seville. Their objective was simple in theory: reach Asia by sailing west. In reality, the journey would become one of the most extraordinary expeditions in history. The fleet crossed the Atlantic, explored the coast of South America. Eventually, it discovered a narrow passage connecting the Atlantic with another immense ocean. Today, that waterway bears Magellan's name, the Strait of Magellan. The passage itself tested both ships and crews. Violent winds, treacherous currents, unfamiliar coastlines. Every kilometer demanded patience. When the fleet finally emerged into the vast ocean beyond, Magellan named it the Pacific. Compared with the storms of the Atlantic crossing, its waters initially appeared remarkably calm. The name endured. The tranquility did not last forever. The crossing proved unimaginably long. The sailors had dramatically underestimated the distance. Food spoiled. Fresh water became scarce. Scurvy spread among the crews. Leather was boiled for food. Rats became valuable sources of protein. Many men died before land finally appeared once again. In 1521, the expedition reached islands within what is now the Philippines. For Spain, this moment represented the first direct contact with the archipelago. For Magellan, it would also become the end of his journey. While attempting to support one local ruler against another on the island of Mactan, Magellan entered a battle he expected to win quickly. Instead, his small force became overwhelmed. Local warriors under the leadership of Lapu-Lapu resisted fiercely. Magellan was killed. The expedition survived. Its commander did not. Only one ship eventually completed the voyage home, the Victoria. Its exhausted crew returned to Spain in 1522. For the first time in recorded history, a single expedition had circumnavigated the globe. The achievement transformed humanity's understanding of the planet. The Earth was no longer merely a theoretical sphere described by scholars. Its oceans had been connected by direct experience. Its true scale had become unmistakably clear. Even so, Spain did not immediately establish a permanent colony in the Philippines. Several practical problems stood in the way. Portugal disputed Spanish claims in Asia. Its commercial network already dominated much of the region. The exact location of the boundary established under the Treaty of Tordesillas remained uncertain on the opposite side of the globe because longitude could not yet be measured accurately. Rather than risk a major conflict, Spain initially concentrated upon consolidating its American possessions. Only decades later did circumstances change. By then, New Spain had become firmly established. Mexico City had grown into one of the empire's greatest cities. Silver production expanded steadily. The crown once again looked westward. In 1565, Miguel López de Legazpi departed from New Spain with a clear objective: establish a permanent Spanish settlement in the Philippines. Legazpi did not travel alone. One of the most important members of the expedition was Andrés de Urdaneta, an experienced navigator and Augustinian friar. Urdaneta possessed decades of maritime knowledge. His contribution would prove just as important as Legazpi's leadership. The expedition crossed the Pacific successfully. Settlements were established first in Cebu. Relationships with local communities varied. Some rulers negotiated alliances. Others resisted. As had happened previously in the Americas, Spanish expansion depended not only upon military force, but also upon diplomacy. Political rivalries among local leaders often shaped outcomes as much as Spanish decisions themselves. Several years later, Legazpi shifted his attention northward. There stood one of the finest natural harbors in Southeast Asia, Manila Bay. In 1571, Spanish forces established Manila as the colonial capital. The choice would shape Pacific history for centuries. Its location offered remarkable advantages. It provided excellent anchorage, access to nearby agricultural regions, connections with Chinese merchants, links to the wider trading networks of Southeast Asia. Very quickly, Manila became much more than a military outpost. It became the center of Spain's Pacific Empire. Unlike Mexico or Peru, however, the Philippines possessed neither vast silver mines nor densely populated imperial capitals comparable to Tenochtitlan or Cusco. Their value lay elsewhere. Geography. The islands occupied one of the most strategic positions in the world. From Manila, Spanish merchants could purchase Chinese silk, porcelain, lacquerware, ivory, spices from Southeast Asia, luxury goods from across the region. The challenge remained transporting those goods across the Pacific. That problem was solved by Andrés de Urdaneta. For years, explorers had managed to sail westward across the Pacific using prevailing trade winds. Returning east proved vastly more difficult. Many expeditions failed. Urdaneta discovered a reliable northern route, sailing first toward Japan before turning east across the North Pacific. Ships eventually reached the coast of North America. From there, they continued south to Acapulco in New Spain. This discovery created one of history's greatest commercial highways, the Manila Galleon. Each year, enormous ships departed Manila carrying valuable cargo. Silk from China, fine porcelain, spices, jewelry, furniture, luxury textiles, artworks. Everything wealthy consumers in the Americas and Europe desired. After reaching Acapulco, goods crossed Mexico by land. Mule caravans carried them to Veracruz. From their Atlantic fleets, transported them onward to Spain. The return voyage carried something equally valuable: silver. Enormous quantities of silver mined in Mexico and Peru crossed the Pacific toward Asia. Chinese merchants eagerly accepted silver as payment. In exchange, luxury goods flowed back toward the Americas and Europe. For more than 2 centuries, this exchange connected 3 continents through a single commercial system. The Manila Galleon became one of the earliest examples of sustained global trade. Products made in China, purchased with American silver, transported by Spanish ships, sold in European markets. The world had become economically interconnected in ways unimaginable only a century earlier. Manila itself grew rapidly. Chinese merchants known by the Spanish as Sanglai established thriving commercial communities. Thousands settled near the city. They supplied textiles, furniture, food, metalwork, craftsmanship. Without their contribution, Manila's economy could not have functioned. Yet success also produced tension. Colonial officials sometimes viewed the growing Chinese population with suspicion. Fears of rebellion, religious differences, economic competition all contributed to periodic violence. Several tragic massacres occurred during the late 16th and 17th centuries. These events revealed once again that Spain's empire depended upon cooperation among diverse peoples. but also that fear and misunderstanding could quickly destroy fragile relationships. Missionary activity expanded throughout the archipelago. Augustinians arrived first, soon joined by Franciscans, Dominicans, Jesuits, other religious orders. Their experiences differed significantly from those in the Americas. The Philippines consisted of thousands of islands, hundreds of languages, numerous independent communities. Islam had already spread across parts of the southern Philippines before Spanish arrival. Animist traditions remained widespread elsewhere. Missionaries, therefore, encountered extraordinary cultural diversity. Many learned local languages, prepared grammars, translated religious texts, established schools. Churches became centers of community life in regions accepting Spanish rule. Catholicism gradually spread across much of Luzon and the Visayas. Its influence remains deeply visible in the Philippines today. Control, however, remained incomplete. Southern regions such as Mindanao and the Sulu archipelago resisted Spanish authority for centuries. Muslim sultanates maintained their independence through diplomacy, warfare, and maritime strength. Spanish expeditions repeatedly attempted conquest. Some achieved temporary successes. None established complete control. The Philippines therefore illustrated both the reach and the limitations of Spanish imperial power. The governor-general ruled from Manila. Yet vast areas beyond direct administration continued following their own political traditions. Communication with Spain required extraordinary patience. Officially, the Philippines belonged to the Viceroyalty of New Spain. Orders often traveled first from Madrid to Mexico, then across the Pacific to Manila. Responses completed the same journey in reverse. A single exchange of correspondence could consume well over a year. Colonial officials therefore exercised enormous discretion. Distance forced flexibility. No empire before had attempted governance on such a planetary scale. The Philippines also demonstrated something larger. Spain was no longer simply an Atlantic empire. It had become a global empire. Ships regularly connected Europe, Africa, the Americas, and Asia. Ideas traveled with merchants. Plants crossed oceans. Animals appeared in entirely new environments. Religious beliefs spread between continents. Silver extracted from the Andes purchased silk woven in China. European books reached Manila. Asian porcelain decorated homes in Mexico City. American crops entered Asian agriculture. The boundaries separating distant civilizations grew steadily thinner. Yet this growing interconnected world carried consequences beyond commerce. Diseases crossed oceans. New foods transformed diets. Migration reshaped societies. Entire ecosystems changed. Historians today refer to this enormous movement of plants, animals, people, technologies, and microorganisms as the Columbian Exchange. It would become one of the most influential processes in all of world history. Its effects reached every inhabited continent, and they would reshape the future of the Spanish Empire just as profoundly as conquest itself. The ships that crossed the Atlantic during the 16th century carried far more than soldiers, priests, merchants, and royal officials. Every voyage transported living things. Some travelers knew exactly what they were bringing. Others had no idea that invisible passengers accompanied them. Seeds rested in cargo holds. Livestock occupied cramped spaces below deck. Rats moved unnoticed through wooden ships. Insects hid among supplies. Most dangerous of all, microscopic organisms traveled with human beings who had no understanding that disease itself could cross an ocean. The consequences would transform the history of the world. Before 1492, the eastern and western hemispheres had developed separately for thousands of years. Plants evolved independently. Animals followed different paths. Human populations adapted to different environments. When regular contact finally began, these separate worlds collided. The process became known centuries later as the Columbian Exchange. Its effects reached every continent. No society remained untouched. Among the most devastating consequences was disease. Europeans unknowingly introduced illnesses that had circulated through Eurasia and Africa for centuries. Smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus. These diseases had long existed in the Old World. Generations of exposure had provided at least some degree of population immunity. In the Americas, however, they were entirely new. Communities possessed no inherited resistance. Outbreaks spread with astonishing speed. Sometimes disease arrived before European armies themselves. Merchants carried infection. Travelers unknowingly passed it from village to village. Trade routes became pathways for epidemics. Entire communities could lose much of their population within months. Modern historians continue debating exact demographic figures because surviving records remain incomplete. Even so, there is broad agreement on one point. The population decline was catastrophic. In many regions, indigenous populations fell by 80 to 90% during the century following European contact. Disease explains much of this tragedy. It was not the only cause. Forced labor, famine, social disruption, displacement. Together, they created one of the greatest demographic collapses in recorded history. For many indigenous societies, the loss extended beyond population. Knowledge disappeared. Elders died before passing on oral traditions. Religious specialists vanished. Political leadership fragmented. Communities that had existed for centuries struggled simply to survive. The transformation reached every aspect of life. Yet the Columbian Exchange was never a one-way movement. The Americas also transformed the Old World. European ships carried home crops unlike anything previously cultivated there. One of the most important was the potato. Originally domesticated high in the Andes, it adapted remarkably well to European climates. It produced abundant harvests even in relatively poor soils. Over time, potatoes became one of Europe's most valuable food sources. Population growth accelerated in many regions partly because of this new crop. Another American plant spread almost as rapidly. Maize. Corn proved adaptable across Africa, Southern Europe, parts of Asia. Its productivity helped sustain expanding populations around the world. Tomatoes followed. At first, many Europeans viewed them cautiously. Some even suspected they might be poisonous because they belonged to the same botanical family as deadly nightshade. Gradually, tomatoes became central ingredients in Mediterranean cooking. Today, it is difficult to imagine Italian cuisine without them. Yet before the 16th century, they were entirely unknown in Europe. Chocolate followed a similar path. For centuries, cacao had held cultural and ceremonial importance in Mesoamerica. Spanish visitors encountered beverages prepared from cacao beans. They adapted the recipes by adding sugar and cinnamon. Soon chocolate spread through Europe as a luxury enjoyed by aristocratic households before eventually becoming accessible to much wider populations. Other American crops continued reshaping global agriculture. Beans, squash, peanuts, pineapples, avocados, vanilla, chili peppers. Each entered distant cuisines in ways no one could have predicted. Meanwhile, Europe sent its own agricultural revolution across the Atlantic. Wheat fields appeared in Mexico. Vineyards expanded into South America. Sugarcane became one of the defining crops of the Caribbean. Its cultivation required enormous labor. As indigenous populations declined, plantation owners increasingly relied upon enslaved Africans. The Atlantic slave trade expanded dramatically. Millions of African men, women, and children were transported across the ocean under horrific conditions. Although several European powers participated in this system over succeeding centuries, Spain's American colonies became deeply connected to it. The demographic landscape of the Americas changed forever. European livestock produced equally dramatic effects. Horses perhaps transformed indigenous societies more visibly than any other introduced animal. Before European arrival, horses no longer existed in the Americas. Within decades, they spread beyond Spanish settlements. Some escaped. Others were traded. Many indigenous peoples quickly recognized their value. Centuries later, nations such as the Comanche and Lakota developed remarkable equestrian cultures that reshaped the history of North America. Cattle spread rapidly across open grasslands. Some formed enormous wild herds. Pigs multiplied so successfully that they sometimes became serious agricultural pests. Sheep and goats altered local grazing patterns. European farming methods gradually transformed landscapes across the hemisphere. The exchange extended beyond biology. Knowledge also traveled. Spanish architects introduced European building techniques. Indigenous engineers shared expertise suited to local environments. Medical knowledge crossed cultural boundaries. Foods merged into entirely new cuisines. Languages borrowed words from one another. Religious traditions adapted through contact. Colonial societies became places of constant cultural negotiation. New identities emerged. People of European, indigenous, African, and mixed ancestry built communities unlike any that had previously existed. These societies contained extraordinary diversity. They also reflected profound inequality. Race increasingly influenced opportunity. Birth affected legal status. Colonial authorities attempted to classify populations into elaborate social categories. Reality, however, remained more complex than official records suggested. Families crossed cultural boundaries. Communities blended traditions. Local identities often mattered as much as formal classifications. While these enormous transformations unfolded across the Atlantic world, another development reshaped Spain itself. The monarchy entered the House of Habsburg. This dynastic change elevated Spain from a powerful European kingdom into the political center of one of history's greatest royal inheritances. The key figure was Charles, known in Spain as Carlos I, known elsewhere as Emperor Charles V. Born in the city of Ghent in 1500, Charles inherited an astonishing collection of territories through family connections. From his mother came Castile, Aragon, the Americas. From his father came the Netherlands and Habsburg possessions. Later, election as Holy Roman Emperor added authority across much of Central Europe. Few rulers have ever inherited so much. His empire stretched across continents. Different languages echoed through its cities. Different laws governed its provinces. Different traditions shaped local politics. No single administrative system united everything. Charles ruled what historians often describe as a composite monarchy. Each territory retained its own institutions, its own legal traditions, its own privileges. The king served as the common link holding everything together. His responsibilities proved overwhelming. He traveled constantly, one year dealing with revolts in Spain, another confronting French armies in Italy, then attending assemblies in Germany, later directing policy toward the Americas. Rarely could he remain in one place for long. Soon after becoming King of Spain, Charles faced serious opposition. Many Castilians resented the arrival of a young monarch raised largely outside Spain. He spoke limited Castilian. He brought foreign advisors. He requested substantial taxes to finance ambitions elsewhere in Europe. Discontent erupted into open rebellion. Known as the Revolt of the Comuneros, the uprising united several important Castilian cities. Its leaders argued that local interests had been ignored. For a time, the rebels posed a genuine challenge. Eventually, however, royal forces defeated them. The rebellion ended. Its lessons remained. Charles recognized that governing Spain required greater sensitivity toward local traditions. His challenges extended far beyond Iberia. In 1517, a German monk named Martin Luther published criticisms of certain practices within the Catholic Church. What began as theological debate soon expanded into the Protestant Reformation. Religious unity across much of Europe fractured. As Holy Roman Emperor, Charles viewed defending Catholicism as one of his central responsibilities. He summoned Luther before the Diet of Worms in 1521. Rather than withdrawing his views, Luther refused. The conflict deepened. Over the following decades, Europe experienced religious divisions unlike anything seen for centuries. Some German princes embraced Protestantism. Others remained Catholic. Political interests often intertwined with religious belief. Charles launched military campaigns attempting to restore unity. Despite important victories, complete success proved impossible. Eventually, the Peace of Augsburg in 1555 accepted a practical compromise. Each ruler within the Holy Roman Empire could determine the religion of his own territory. It represented a major shift in European politics. Religious unity could no longer be assumed. Meanwhile, another formidable rival challenged Habsburg ambitions. France. King Francis I competed directly with Charles for influence across Europe. Their rivalry dominated much of 16th century diplomacy. Campaigns in Italy became especially fierce. Victory passed back and forth. Neither side achieved permanent dominance. The wars consumed enormous resources. The Mediterranean presented another front. There, the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent expanded rapidly. Ottoman armies advanced into Central Europe. Their fleets challenged Christian naval power. North African corsairs threatened Mediterranean shipping. Charles directed significant military resources toward defending Habsburg interests against Ottoman expansion. Even with immense territories and growing American wealth, He found himself constantly balancing competing priorities. Throughout these struggles, the Americas continued changing. New settlements expanded. Silver production increased. Missionaries established churches. Colonial governments matured. Charles took a close interest in overseas administration. He reviewed reports from colonial officials, approved legislation, supported missionary activity, ordered investigations into abuses. The distance separating Europe from America remained enormous. Yet the monarch increasingly viewed overseas territories not as distant possessions, but as integral parts of his wider realm. Still, endless responsibility gradually exhausted him. Decades of warfare, political negotiations, religious conflict, administrative burdens, all took their toll. In 1556, Charles made a decision almost unimaginable for a ruler of his stature. He abdicated. Rather than allowing his vast inheritance to remain united, he divided it. His brother Ferdinand inherited the Austrian Habsburg lands and the title of Holy Roman Emperor. His son Philip received Spain, the Netherlands, southern Italy, the Americas, and Spain's growing overseas empire. Charles retired to the monastery of Yusti in western Spain. There he spent his remaining years in relative seclusion before dying in 1558. His reign had reshaped world history. When he first became king, Spain was already expanding overseas. By the time he left power, it stood at the center of the first truly global empire. His successor would inherit not only extraordinary opportunities, he would also inherit extraordinary challenges. Under Philip II, the Spanish Empire would reach its greatest territorial extent. It would also begin encountering the pressures that eventually tested even the most powerful empire on earth. When Charles V retired from public life in 1556, he left behind an empire unlike anything the world had ever seen. His son, Philip II, inherited Spain, the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, the rich territories of Italy, the Netherlands, the Americas, and Spain's expanding possessions across the Pacific. Never before had so much land been governed by a single European monarch. From the silver mines of Mexico and Peru to the ports of Naples and the islands of the Caribbean, from the forests of the Low Countries to distant settlements in Asia, Philip ruled over an empire so vast that people would later say the sun never set upon it. Unlike his father, Philip rarely traveled through his dominions. Instead, he governed from Spain, transforming Madrid into the permanent political center of the monarchy. Near the capital, he built El Escorial, a palace, monastery, library, and royal residence whose austere design reflected both his personality and his vision of kingship. From its halls flowed an endless stream of royal decrees, letters, reports, and orders that attempted to direct events occurring thousands of miles away. Every week, couriers arrived carrying news from Mexico, Peru, Naples, Flanders, and Manila. Every decision reminded Philip that ruling the largest empire on earth required extraordinary patience and organization. Religion stood at the center of his reign. Philip believed deeply that the Spanish monarchy had been entrusted with defending Catholicism at a time when Europe was becoming increasingly divided. The Protestant Reformation continued spreading across northern Europe, and Philip saw himself not merely as a king, but as the protector of the Catholic faith. That conviction shaped almost every aspect of his foreign policy. Nowhere did these tensions become more dangerous than in the Netherlands. The 17 provinces of the Low Countries were among the wealthiest regions in Europe. Their merchants dominated trade. Their cities prospered through manufacturing and finance. Yet many inhabitants had embraced Protestant ideas, particularly Calvinism. At the same time, they resisted Philip's efforts to strengthen royal authority and increase taxation. In 1566, unrest erupted into open revolt. Protesters attacked churches, destroying religious images in what became known as the iconoclastic fury. Philip responded by sending one of his most experienced commanders, the Duke of Alba, with a veteran army to restore order. The Duke established a special tribunal, later remembered by many as the Council of Blood, because of the large number of executions it ordered. Rather than ending resistance, these harsh measures strengthened it. The conflict evolved into the 80 Years' War. What began as rebellion gradually became a struggle for independence. Leaders such as William of Orange united many of the provinces against Spanish rule. The northern provinces eventually formed the Dutch Republic, while the southern provinces remained under Spanish control. The war drained enormous resources and forced Spain into one of the longest military commitments in its history. While conflict raged in northern Europe, another great struggle unfolded in the Mediterranean. The Ottoman Empire had become one of the most powerful states in the world. Under Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent and his successors, Ottoman armies advanced into southeastern Europe while their fleets dominated much of the eastern Mediterranean. Spanish territories in Italy and North Africa faced constant pressure. Recognizing the scale of the challenge, Philip joined with Venice and the Papal States to form the Holy League. In 1571, their combined fleet met the Ottoman navy near the Gulf of Patras in western Greece at the Battle of Lepanto. The battle became one of the most famous naval engagements in history. Hundreds of galleys filled the sea. Thousands of soldiers fought aboard crowded ships. Cannons thundered across the water. Boarding parties clashed hand to hand. When the fighting finally ended, the Holy League had achieved a decisive victory. The Ottoman fleet suffered enormous losses. Although the empire quickly rebuilt much of its navy, Lepanto halted the image of unstoppable Ottoman expansion and became a symbol of Christian resistance. Across Europe, church bells rang in celebration. Painters, poets, and chroniclers portrayed the battle as one of the defining victories of the age. Among those who fought, there was a young Spanish soldier named Miguel de Cervantes. Years later, he would write one of the greatest novels ever produced. But at Lepanto, he fought not with a pen, but with a sword. Even as Spain celebrated victory in the Mediterranean, events elsewhere revealed how difficult it had become to defend such a vast empire. Relations with England deteriorated steadily after the accession of Queen Elizabeth I. England had embraced Protestantism and openly supported the Dutch rebels. English privateers, such as Francis Drake, attacked Spanish shipping, raided Caribbean settlements, and captured valuable cargoes returning from the Americas. Philip concluded that only decisive action could end the threat. He ordered preparations for an enormous invasion fleet, the Spanish Armada. In 1588, more than 130 ships assembled, thousands of sailors, thousands of soldiers, weapons, supplies, everything necessary for one of the largest naval expeditions ever attempted. The plan required the fleet to sail through the English Channel, rendezvous with the Duke of Parma's army in the Netherlands, and escort that army across the Channel for an invasion of England. The operation depended upon precise coordination. It never achieved it. English ships proved faster and more maneuverable. Their commanders avoided close combat whenever possible, using long-range cannon fire to harass the Spanish formation. At the Battle of Gravelines, English fire ships scattered the tightly organized armada. Soon afterward, powerful storms drove many Spanish vessels northward. Unable to return through the channel, the surviving ships attempted to sail around Scotland and Ireland. Violent weather completed the disaster. Many vessels were wrecked against rocky coastlines. Thousands of sailors perished. Less than half of the fleet eventually returned to Spain. The defeat shocked Europe. It did not destroy Spanish naval power overnight, nor did it immediately end Spain's position as a global empire. Spanish fleets continued crossing the Atlantic for many years. Yet the failure of the Armada became a powerful symbol. It demonstrated that even the mightiest empire could be challenged. Despite military setbacks, Philip continued expanding his monarchy. In 1580, the Portuguese king died without a direct heir. Philip, whose mother had been a Portuguese princess, claimed the throne. After a brief campaign, he became King Philip I of Portugal. The union transformed the Spanish monarchy once again. Portugal brought with it Brazil, trading posts along the African coast, colonies in India, ports in Southeast Asia, and commercial connections reaching as far as Japan. For 60 years, nearly the entire Iberian Peninsula stood united under one monarch. No European ruler possessed a wider global reach. Ships flying either the Spanish or Portuguese flag connected almost every ocean on Earth. Yet governing such an immense empire came at tremendous cost. Wars consumed silver arriving from the Americas almost as quickly as it reached Spain. Inflation spread throughout Europe. Royal debts mounted. More than once the Spanish crown declared bankruptcy, not because the empire lacked wealth, but because military commitments exceeded even its extraordinary revenues. At the very moment when Spain's political power reached its greatest extent, its culture entered an age of astonishing creativity. Historians remember this period as the Spanish Golden Age. Its greatest literary figure was Miguel de Cervantes. After surviving Lepanto, years of captivity in North Africa, and repeated financial difficulties, Cervantes published Don Quixote in the early 17th century. The novel followed an aging gentleman so captivated by tales of chivalry that he convinced himself he was a knight destined to revive a vanished age of heroism. Accompanied by the practical Sancho Panza, Don Quixote rode across Spain confronting imaginary giants, misunderstood adventures, and a world that no longer matched his dreams. What appeared at first to be comedy became something much deeper. The novel explored illusion and reality, honor and disappointment, idealism and change. Today it is widely regarded as one of the greatest works in world literature. Spanish theater flourished as well. Lope de Vega transformed drama by writing hundreds of plays filled with romance, conflict, humor, and questions of justice. Later, Pedro Calderón de la Barca explored philosophy, destiny, and free will in masterpieces such as Life is a Dream. Spanish painting reached extraordinary heights. El Greco brought a unique style filled with dramatic colors and elongated figures that reflected intense spiritual emotion. A generation later, Diego Velázquez became court painter to Philip IV, creating portraits whose realism and psychological depth continue to influence artists today. His masterpiece, Los Meninas, remains one of the most studied paintings in history. While artists transformed European culture, another story unfolded across the Pacific. In 1565, Miguel López de Legazpi established the first permanent Spanish settlement in the Philippines. Several years later, he founded Manila. Few cities would become more important to global commerce. From Manila, enormous galleons sailed across the Pacific carrying Chinese silk, porcelain, spices, ivory, and luxury goods to Acapulco in New Spain. They returned loaded with silver mined in Mexico and Peru. This Manila galleon trade continued for more than 2 centuries. It connected Asia, the Americas, and Europe through a single commercial network unlike anything the world had previously experienced. Chinese merchants settled in Manila. Mexican silver circulated through Chinese markets. European consumers decorated their homes with Asian porcelain purchased using American bullion. For the first time in history, global trade operated on a truly continuous scale. Yet beneath these remarkable achievements, signs of strain continued growing. Spain remained immensely powerful. Its armies were respected. Its fleets still crossed every ocean. Its culture flourished, but maintaining dominance required endless war, endless taxation, and endless shipments of American silver. Future generations would inherit not only the greatest empire on earth, they would also inherit the immense burden of trying to preserve it. As the 17th century gave way to the 18th, the Spanish Empire remained one of the largest political entities on Earth. Its territories stretched across Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Ships still crossed the Atlantic carrying silver from Mexico and Peru. Manila remained connected to Acapulco through the Pacific. Catholic missionaries continued establishing churches across distant frontiers. Yet beneath this appearance of stability, the balance of power was changing. Other European kingdoms had grown stronger. England expanded its navy. The Dutch Republic became one of the world's great commercial powers. France emerged as Spain's principal rival on the continent. The immense wealth that had once made Spain the dominant power in Europe could no longer guarantee victory in every conflict. When King Charles II died in 1700 without an heir, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty came to an end. His death created one of the greatest diplomatic crises of the age. Several European dynasties claimed the right to inherit the Spanish throne, and their competing ambitions soon drew much of Europe into the War of the Spanish Succession. For more than a decade, armies fought across Spain, Italy, Germany, and the Low Countries. The conflict was never simply about who would become king. It was also about preventing any single European power from dominating the continent. Eventually, the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 recognized Philip V of the Bourbon dynasty as King of Spain, but only after Spain surrendered many of its European possessions. The Spanish Netherlands passed to Austria. Naples and Milan were lost. Gibraltar and Minorca came under British control, with Gibraltar remaining under British sovereignty to this day. The Bourbon kings understood that if Spain hoped to remain a great power, the empire needed reform. During the 18th century, they reorganized colonial administration, created new viceroyalties, strengthened tax collection, modernized the army, and encouraged trade between Spanish ports and the Americas. They reduced the influence of some traditional institutions while increasing the authority of the crown. For a time, these reforms produced results. Trade expanded. Colonial economies grew. Ports such as Havana, Buenos Aires, and Caracas flourished. Scientific expeditions mapped unknown regions. Roads improved. Government became more efficient. Yet every reform created new tensions. Creole elites, Spaniards born in the Americas, increasingly resented the preference shown to officials sent from Spain. Indigenous communities faced heavier taxes and labor demands. Many believed the empire expected more from them while giving little in return. Discontent gradually spread. In Peru, a leader known as Tupac Amaru II invoked the memory of the last Inca rulers and led one of the largest uprisings in colonial history. He demanded an end to abuses against indigenous communities and called for sweeping reforms. Although the rebellion was eventually crushed and Tupac Amaru II was executed, the movement revealed how deeply dissatisfaction had spread across the Andes. Elsewhere, similar revolts appeared. In New Granada, in Upper Peru, in rural Mexico, the empire remained intact, but its foundations no longer seemed as secure as they once had. At the same time, new political ideas crossed the Atlantic. The American Revolution demonstrated that European colonies could achieve independence. The French Revolution challenged long-standing ideas about monarchy and political authority. Enlightenment thinkers argued that governments should derive legitimacy from the consent of the governed rather than divine right alone. Spanish officials attempted to limit the spread of these ideas. They could not stop them entirely. Then came the crisis that changed everything. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain. Under pressure, the Spanish royal family abdicated, and Napoleon placed his own brother Joseph Bonaparte on the Spanish throne. For the first time in centuries, Spain itself was occupied by a foreign army. Across the country, ordinary people rose in resistance. Local governing councils, known as juntas, claimed authority in the name of the imprisoned king, Ferdinand VII. The Peninsular War became one of the bloodiest conflicts of the Napoleonic era. Guerrilla warfare exhausted French forces. British armies under the Duke of Wellington joined the struggle. After years of fighting, Napoleon's occupation finally collapsed. But while Spain fought for its own survival, events across the Atlantic had taken on a life of their own. The colonies had watched the monarchy disappear. They had watched local juntas assume authority. Many now asked the simple question: if Spain could govern itself in the absence of a king, why could Spanish America not do the same? At first, many colonial governments claimed loyalty to Ferdinand VII. Gradually, those movements evolved into demands for complete independence. In the north of South America, Simón Bolívar emerged as the leading figure of revolution. Driven by the dream of a free and united Latin America, he led campaigns across Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and eventually Peru. His crossing of the Andes in 1819 remains one of history's greatest military achievements. Against enormous odds, his army defeated Spanish forces and secured the independence of northern South America. Farther south, another remarkable commander, José de San Martín, organized the struggle for liberation in Argentina. He crossed the Andes into Chile, defeated royalist armies, and then sailed north to Peru. There his path crossed with Bolívar's. Although the details of their famous meeting remain uncertain, San Martín stepped aside, leaving Bolívar to complete the final campaigns. In 1824, the Battle of Ayacucho brought Spanish rule in mainland South America to an end. Centuries of colonial government had collapsed. In Mexico, the road to independence followed a different course. In 1810, a parish priest, named Miguel Hidalgo issued the famous Grito de Dolores, calling upon the people to rise against colonial rule. Though Hidalgo was captured and executed, the movement survived. José María Morelos continued the struggle. Years later, changing political circumstances united former royalists and revolutionaries behind a common cause. In 1821, Mexico became independent. One by one, Spain's American possessions disappeared. Only Cuba and Puerto Rico remained in the Caribbean. Across the Pacific, the Philippines also remained under Spanish rule. For the first time since the age of Columbus, the empire no longer dominated the Americas. Spain itself struggled through decades of political instability, civil wars, military coups, constitutional experiments, economic challenges. Industrialization arrived more slowly than in many neighboring countries. Even so, the country attempted to preserve its remaining overseas territories. In Cuba, demands for independence intensified during the 19th century. Long wars exhausted both rebels and Spanish forces. In the Philippines, a new educated generation called for reform. Among its leading voices was José Rizal, whose novels exposed injustice and inspired growing nationalism. His execution in 1896 turned him into a martyr. Revolution followed. Then another power entered the story, the United States. Sympathy for the Cuban independence movement had grown among many Americans. Newspapers published dramatic reports describing conditions under Spanish rule. When the American battleship USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in 1898, public opinion demanded action. War followed. The Spanish-American War lasted only a few months. In the Pacific, the American fleet destroyed the Spanish squadron at Manila Bay. In the Caribbean, Spanish naval forces suffered another decisive defeat near Santiago de Cuba. Spanish resistance collapsed rapidly. The Treaty of Paris, signed later that year, ended more than 4 centuries of overseas expansion. Spain relinquished Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The empire that had begun with Columbus's voyage in 1492 had effectively come to an end. For Spain, the defeat became known simply as the disaster of 1898. It forced the nation to confront difficult questions. How had the world's greatest empire disappeared? What remained after centuries of expansion had come to an end? Writers, philosophers, and historians searched for answers. Some argued Spain needed modernization. Others reflected on the costs of empire itself. The country gradually turned inward, focusing increasingly on its own social and political future. Yet although the empire vanished politically, its legacy never disappeared. Today, Spanish is one of the most widely spoken languages on Earth. From Mexico to Argentina, from Spain to Equatorial Guinea, across much of the United States, and throughout communities around the world. Hundreds of millions of people speak a language carried across oceans more than 5 centuries ago. Catholicism remains deeply rooted throughout Latin America and the Philippines. Colonial cities built around central plazas still serve as political and cultural centers. Legal traditions established under Spanish rule continue influencing modern judicial systems. Architectural styles introduced during the colonial era remain visible in cathedrals, government buildings, universities, and town squares across several continents. The empire also left a more difficult inheritance. Its expansion brought violence, disease, forced labor, the Atlantic slave trade, the destruction of countless indigenous societies. Many communities continue living with the consequences of those centuries. At the same time, entirely new cultures emerge from the meeting of indigenous, European, African, and Asian peoples. Languages blended. Foods crossed oceans. Music evolved. Religious traditions mixed. New nations eventually grew from those shared histories. Today, historians no longer view the Spanish Empire as simply a story of conquest or decline. It was both. It spread Christianity while also suppressing existing beliefs. It founded universities while also exploiting labor. It connected continents through trade while also reshaping societies through war and disease. Its history contains remarkable achievements alongside profound human suffering. Understanding that complexity is essential to understanding the modern world. The rise of Spain transformed global exploration. Its colonies connected Europe, Africa, the Americas, and Asia into the first truly worldwide imperial network. Its silver fueled international commerce. Its ships linked oceans. Its language crossed continents. Its institutions influenced generations. For more than 3 centuries, decisions made in Madrid affected people living thousands of miles away. Few empires have left a broader mark on world history. The Spanish Empire rose from the union of 2 Iberian kingdoms. It expanded across oceans through ambition, navigation, conquest, diplomacy, and faith. It reached a scale no previous monarchy had imagined. Then, slowly, through war, economic strain, political change, and the rise of new powers, it declined. But history rarely ends when an empire falls. It continues in the nations that emerge afterward, in the languages people speak, in the cities they inhabit, in the traditions they preserve, and in the questions each generation continues asking about power, identity, justice, and memory. The Spanish Empire no longer exists. Its influence still does.